I'm Patricia O'Keefe and I'm a Senior Land Services Officer in Livestock Advice with Central West Local Land Services, as Claire said, based out of Dubbo. And there are a couple of my colleagues here today as well. So Matt, who you heard from before, but also Chioma, who's our Natural Capital Advisor, who's over there as well. And basically, I guess the work that I do or our team does in local land services in this sort of emissions and methane area is sort of more to do with working with our producers and helping them to understand what the information means, but also helping them to improve on-farm productivity. And as everyone here would be well aware, because you've all signed up basically for an entire day of talking about methane, there is a hell of a lot of talk out there about emissions and methane. There's a lot of talk from the political side of things. There's also a lot of people who have some very strong opinions about things, and there's a lot of information coming out of industry about it. And some of the feedback that I've received from some of the producers that I have worked with in our region within Central West is that because there's so much talk about methane and emissions, it creates a lot of confusion for them, and that confusion and all that talk results in them being a bit resistant to it. So these are just some of the questions that have sort of come out of that feedback that we receive from the producers we work with. And for producers, it's really about what it means for them, and more specifically, whether the strategies to reduce methanes have an impact on production, whether that be a positive impact on production or whether it's a negative impact on production. And from the agriculture advisor or agriculture industry professional side of things, some of the questions are about how is it that we assist the people we're working with or the end users of that information to understand it, and how is it that we make that information relevant to their system. So I actually thought at this point that I'd probably try and use today to get a bit of feedback from everyone who's here today to see whether there were other questions that you had or thoughts you had that might assist us in LLS to better target our work with people. But so that I don't run drastically over time and upset Claire, I thought I might leave that to the end. But also too, you can see what I've put together, and then maybe you can give me a bit more feedback of what things myself and our team can be doing to better meet people's needs and help them address what it is that they need out of us to understand the information. As Claire sort of very briefly mentioned this morning, there are a few different ways to look at reducing emissions, and one of the ways is to reduce emissions per animal, and so the total amount of methane produced. And that's basically what a lot of the talks today and the research is focusing on. And so there's research into like the different plant species. So do different plant species when consumed by the animals that result in less methane being produced, as well as looking at genetically selecting plants, some of the work into the rumen environment and rumen microbes. And also there's some work looking at plant secondary compounds, so such as the tannins, and what impact they have on reducing emissions. Also some areas that we've heard about this morning and earlier today, so the genetic selection of animals. So as Tracy spoke about with the low methane beef project, where they're looking at producing those breeding values that producers can then incorporate into their production system and use, but also through their project, they're testing what the implications are, like what Tracy spoke about with the trade-offs with the growth rate as well. And similarly with the low methane sheep project that Ed spoke about, same thing again, they're producing those breeding values for producers to incorporate into their operating system. And through that project, they're also testing whether selecting for lower methane producing sheep results in improved efficiency of meat and wool production. And also what we heard just before lunch from Jess, the work around the methane reducing additives. So out of that project, they'll be able to develop the guidelines that producers can use to improve delivery of those additives into their animals. And earlier this morning when we heard from Letitia, looking at the volatile fatty acids, where they're validating whether they can be used by producers on farm to monitor emissions, and therefore leads to them being able to genetically select for those lower emitting animals. So that's the research side of things. I think Claire described it to me earlier in the week as the future, things that can be done in the future. And the other way of looking at it is to increase the efficiency of production. And so we're looking at the reductions of the emissions per unit of product, and that's what I think Claire mentioned, emissions intensity. And so they're the things that can be done now on farm, and that's where most of our work is directed in this area at present. So as everyone here already knows, production efficiency means minimum input, so whether that's time, money or resources for maximum output. So in agricultural production, we're obviously talking maximum output of the product and therefore profits. And if we're maximising our productivity on farm, we're starting with our soils, making sure they're healthy and productive so we can get our good quality pastures. So we've got good quality feed for our animals, both of high quantity to meet the animals' needs and sufficient quality to meet their nutritional requirements, so that our animals are happy, healthy and productive. So they're growing quickly and our producers are able to get their animals to their targets as soon as possible. So if we're looking at our productive pastures, what we're talking about is efficiently meeting our animals' nutritional requirements. And we're wanting to ensure that the pastures are of sufficient quantity, but also of good quality. So looking at the digestibility, the energy to protein, to ensure that that's sufficient for what our animals need at different states in their production cycle. And also important in that is the height as well. And what you're wanting to be doing is also managing your entire system to be able to improve the utilisation of the feed. And has anyone in here done the ProGraze course at all? Claire has. Anyone else? Like ProGraze course, done the ProGraze? Some people. So if you're not familiar with it, it's basically a course which is basically takes you through all of these things. So it's looking at teaching you how to assess the quantity of pasture. It talks about the importance of quality, the nutritional requirements of the animals and how to match your pastures with your livestock's needs at certain times. And this graph I basically just pulled straight out of the manual you get when you do that course, and it was just a simple way of basically showing that, as we all know, we've got different plant species or different plant types, and they have, so at different times of the year, they will be most productive. Does that make sense? Did I describe that correctly? So different plant types will have different times of year when they're most productive. So if you can see in this graph, it's a bit small, but so this black line is oats and this orange line here is tropical grass. So you can see there, it's the growth of the plants here, and you can see at certain times of the year, so this is the months of the year along here, that some are higher and some are lower. So if we're managing our system to improve the utilisation of our feed, what we're really doing is we're looking at what our feed is when our pastures or our feed base is most productive, and we're looking at our livestock and our animals and seeing when throughout the production cycle they have their highest feed demands, and we're matching that up to when there's the most available feed. So for example, when they're pregnant or they're lactating, or you've got a lot of animals in the paddock and they're growing and you're wanting them to meet particular growth weights, you'll have higher feed demand for them, so you want to match those up with when the pastures are most abundant and most available and of highest quality. And part of that too is also looking to see, for example, of if you've got a spot where there's a feed deficit or there's a feed gap, and you're wanting to avoid those periods when animals have their highest demands, but also too, if you have an unavoidable period where there is a feed gap, you need to look at your system and manipulate it so that you're covering that. So it might be something like forage conservation. And an example of how you can do that is through species selection. And the reason I chose that example is because in this graph it had the temperate species and it was just easy to use it as an example. So this orange line, as I said before, is the tropical species, and you can see that they're most productive during the summer months when the temperates are missing in action basically. And so that's all lovely that I've just stood up here and banged on about how wonderful having productive pastures are at a methane day. But the reason for that is because we're talking about getting the nutrition right in our animals, which means that we can have maximum growth rate in our livestock and that we've got our healthy animals. They're healthy, they're not getting sick, they're not falling over all the time because their nutritional needs are met. That then means with our maximum growth rates, we can reduce our time to meet the targets, and therefore we're reducing the amount of time they're producing methane and we're turning them off the property sooner, in theory. It can also mean we've got less wastage and fewer losses, so we don't have sick animals going down and dying. And obviously those losses will produce methane, but then you get nothing back for them. So overall, it means we've got more productive animals, and so we can have the same amount of product with fewer animals on farm, in theory. Obviously, getting the nutrition right is meaning we've got productive animals, but some other things you can be doing to ensure you've got productive animals is early breeding, with the clause that you still have to make sure that they've met the minimum weight requirements so that joining is effective. But the reason that is because our breeding animals don't really contribute economically until they have their first offspring. And so the longer you leave it, they're producing methane and they're not contributing anything. So if you bring joining earlier so that they're having their first offspring sooner, they're able to contribute economically sooner and reducing that methane production. Other ways are to retain your high-performing females and cull the non-performing animals, as well as genetically selecting for your target traits. So you're basically just ensuring that your herd or your flock there is the most productive it can be. And also things like enhancing fertility, so you're ensuring they've got correct nutrition to meet their needs. And so you've got fewer breeding animals with the same number of offspring, ideally, but also tightening the breeding cycle. So sticking to those recommended joining times and weaning times, so you're not, thinking, oh, I'll just let joining go for another 2 weeks, and oh, we don't want to take the calves off the cows because they might be a bit sad, so we'll leave them in for another 4 weeks, because then you're ending up pushing out your whole cycle further and further until you're missing time and things are just pushing way out of proportion. And another important one, or the most important one, is ensuring good health. So undertaking good husbandry practices to prevent diseases, so drenching, vaccinating, and if you're bringing in animals, good quality or good quarantine to prevent anything being brought in that you don't want. So that was basically just sort of a quick run through of some things that you can sort of be doing on farm now. And basically everything that I've just said are things that you already know, people are already doing, but it's about doing them more efficiently and tightening up the system and manipulating a few things so that we're improving our production on farm. And it is about managing the entire system as a whole. So looking at the soils, the pastures and the animals as well. And also knowing your numbers. Claire made the point about knowing your numbers, but it is more important. Claire talked about that a lot more than me, but you have to know your numbers. And looking at the business as a whole, as I said, we're talking about the entire system, but not just the production system, your entire business. And the reason I put that point in was to give a little plug to this survey, because we're actually running a project with Central West Local Land Services at the moment that's funded by the federal government, the Climate Smart Ag funding, and 5 minutes. We're running some benchmarking groups as part of that project, and part of those benchmarking groups is to do their numbers on the methane and the emissions as well. And I thought that was a good way of asking you all very kindly if you could please pull out your phones and do this survey. And if not, I think Matt's probably going to give you a bit of a hard time. But that was basically all I sort of wanted to cover through with that.